Hey, Krista, thank you for coming in. You have just an amazing background, both from an educational background, but also in contribution in mathematics and in quantum science and in technology. And now you're a distinguishing engineer and vice president of advanced quantum development at Microsoft. And there's some really amazing news that have come out, like breakthroughs and things like that. So I want to delve into that. So
Wonderful.
really appreciate it coming in. Thank you
Well,
again.
thank you for the invitation. I'm looking forward to our discussion today.
So, Krista, you've got this really marvelous career and just tremendous contributions, and really your North Star to the audience, and especially those who are still earlier in their careers. So, maybe you can share two or three inflection points that made this wonderful person you are today in terms of contribution, both professionally and personally, and so on. And it could be something when you were 3 or 5, there's something in the family, outside the family, something in school. What were those magic moments that created this wonderful person you are?
Oh, well, thank you so much. I think, part of the magic moments I'm just so grateful for, of course, my parents who really always supported my dreams and my ambitions and really encouraged me to continue even when things were challenging or difficult, right? So I think at an early age, I always have loved puzzles, loved challenges, loved putting pieces together. And over time, I learned that I love doing that with computers, right? But I didn't know, I really didn't do a lot with computers in the early days. I played some early games on on early devices, but really didn't get into computer science until later when I was in college. But I think the magic moments for me, I remember having an opportunity with my physics teacher in high school, right? Who I think it's really about having someone that supports you and sees something in you that maybe you don't see for yourself, right? And he believed in me and he said, Krista, I think you're gonna love research. You love science. You really should, you should start working with a researcher now. Let me set you up with someone at Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center. And so that became my first, it became actually a class for me, right? I went every day for 2 years in high school to work with this amazing woman, Dr. Jan Chalepny, who was at Fred Hutch at the time. And we did science together, right? We did discovery and invention and innovation, right? I worked on understanding sub-T13 cells, right, for cancer research at the time. And it was my first research paper. And it just inspired me that, wow, you could take a mixture of mathematics and science and you could use it together, right? Apply it and make great discoveries for the world, right? For society. So that really sat with me. And so when I went to college, I knew I wanted to continue on this experimental path, right? This idea of doing scientific discovery. And it took, different forms. I learned I was less interested in kind of the wet lab and more interested in the computational lab. And so as I've traversed my career, and had different experiences, right? I've really ended up in this computational discovery zone, right? I worked on understanding machine learning, and then shifted back. I was doing quantum computing and shifted back towards quantum computing, and a little later after I did machine learning for a little while. But always through and through, it's been about discovery and also applying that discovery, right? I think the other magic moments for me, I remember the first time we deployed an algorithm that I had helped develop, right, and invent at Microsoft. And the fact that that reaches millions of people around the world, that was another amazing moment. So it's these moments where there's kind of a belief that others have in you, and then it traverses over to a belief in what you're doing can make a difference. And I think those together have just really shaped my interests and what I want to work on.
So what I'm hearing is that, you came from a family environment which sort of encouraged confidence, but also purpose and curiosity. And then you had this high school teacher in physics who said, you know what, you're actually quite talented, or you have this kind of curiosity and ability. So let me see if I can challenge you even further. I can't believe you studied like 2 years in doing this extracurricular activities and then getting into really translational work and biomedical innovation in a sense, right? And then but still having this interest on the computational side and ending up more on the computational side
Hmm.
science and quantum computing. But I can see that early interest in physics tying
Yes.
in with your work with quantum. And then you discover and create this algorithms, and you get to deploy it and see it scale globally, and it continues your engagement and excitement and purposeful contribution again. So it's just a marvelous story, and a great story for the audience, for those out there who are early in their careers and they're saying, hey, what can I do? Well, you're a role model. So they should all
Oh,
follow
thank
your
you.
work. Be followers you on LinkedIn, or if you're on X or any of the other platforms, follow your work, because that's just marvelous. So how did you get into Microsoft? Can you describe that journey? Because Microsoft is an amazing company. It's outstanding. It's been around for a long time, and it's
Yes.
across so many different areas. And it definitely has this translational aspect, translational meaning. Let's take some great work, IP, but let's translate it to useful things, right?
Uh-huh.
How did that journey start? How did you get interested in Microsoft?
Yeah, so I might be one of the unique few now, but I grew up in the Seattle area. So I grew up knowing Microsoft, right? Microsoft sat in essentially my backyard growing up. It was a very different company at that time, and it's really, I think, for me joining Microsoft, I initially joined Microsoft to be in Microsoft research, right? It was a place where I really could work with the best computer scientists and scientists more generally in the world, right? All in one place. And it's bigger than any university department, right? It was just such a large number of really PhDs and masters in computer science, right? So when I joined MSR. And so that was a place where I could further this innovation, right? And then apply to people, right? So what I love about Microsoft, especially now, is the mission is so true, right? It really is carried through every thread, right? To empower people, empower organizations to do more. That's exactly what I have wanted to do, right? In applying these computational skills and looking at, I like to look at that pioneering edge, right? Of technology, and then see how can you bring that pioneering edge in and apply it to the real world. And so Microsoft, it's just such a great place to do that, right? Because they're interested in empowering people around the world. The company is all about empowering organizations, and it's about doing more. So this idea of being able to accelerate discovery, accelerate science, right? Be able to find out new properties, new things, but then bring it home, right? Literally home, right? Impact people, society, right? Impact the next generation. It's really Microsoft's mission and its ability to apply things in such a global scale that attracted me to the company.
So can you describe then your different roles at Microsoft, and then how you entered into specifically the quantum information science and technology part of it? And really, to the audience, quantum is really big. There's quantum sensors and quantum communications and
Mhm.
safe computing, and the computational is just one part of it, right? So, and there's a lot of curiosity and unknowns in quantum computing in that sense as well. So, but you hear these really amazing breakthroughs. I would say almost daily. I see these news items like, wow, that's incredible. So, can you describe your sort of quantum journey within Microsoft, and how that progressed?
Yeah.
Then we'll get into some of the breakthroughs that have been announced.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, so, for me, my quantum journeys, it really began before Microsoft. So I was in college, and I was a math major in college, and I was taking a course from Andrew Wiles, Dr. Andrew Wiles, and for many of you, you probably know him as solving Fermat's last theorem, right? He took many years to solve that problem. So he was this inspirational professor, right? And he had a seminar on cryptography. And in that seminar, this is just shortly, just a couple years after Shor's algorithm came out. So Peter Shor had developed this algorithm on how one could potentially break RSA if you had a quantum computer, right? So he gave the quantum algorithm, but of course at that time, and still now even, right? Quantum machines weren't, are not at the scale that they can run this algorithm yet. But this algorithm existed, and I was fascinated by this algorithm, right? The fact that there's this other model of computation that could break mathematical problems that we have thought are hard, right? We literally rely on these problems for security. Every time you put your credit card on the internet, right, it's encrypted using different encryption techniques. And this algorithm showed that a number of those could be broken. I was fascinated by this, right? It was just eye-opening. So I went on to study quantum computing for my PhD. And in particular, I wanted to bring it together with the compute side, right? I was fascinated by this computational model that you could develop algorithms using this model, right? Things that aren't just bits, right? Now you have these quantum bits that take on new states, and you can use them in different ways and apply different operations. So I wanted to study that. And I wanted to understand, how could you make a machine, right? How could you actually program a machine and create a stack that it would enable you to actually convey these algorithms to that hardware, right? So I really wanted to get into that quantum computer science, right? And studied the software stack of quantum computing, quantum programming languages, and also how you would achieve quantum fault tolerance. So how would you make the machine less noisy? So I did that work in graduate school. And in finishing my dissertation, at the same time, right, this algorithm PageRank had come out, and I was looking at that, right. It was the this is the early days of ranking algorithms for web search, and this was one of the first ones that really changed how we now approach web search. So I really wanted to understand that algorithm. I was playing with that algorithm. I wrote a few papers on machine learning during graduate school. And I thought, you know what? The quantum computing hardware at the time was not as advanced as it is now. And I thought, I really want to apply my skills. I want to apply algorithms in the real world. So I actually joined Microsoft Research to look at machine learning, right? And so this was in the early 2000s. And machine learning was not now, right, the AI we see today and we're enjoying, right? But it was, we had not yet deployed a machine learning algorithm as a product in Microsoft, right? So I joined MSR to develop these machine learning algorithms. And so we worked on the kind of the early algorithms that now, that ultimately ended up resulting in Bing, right? The Bing search engine. Earlier it was Live. This was even pre-live. But we ended up working on these algorithms. And at the same time, while I absolutely loved working in machine learning, and I learned so very much about what it meant to deploy algorithms on real data, right? Data coming from humans and interactions and clicks and time. And I learned so much about that. At the same time, in my heart, I felt this yearning for quantum computing, right? I was just missing that quantum aspect, and it was this wonderful moment of the snowstorm in Redmond that kept me on campus, and at the time Michael Friedman, who had just started the quantum computing research at Microsoft, a group called Station Q. And we both got stuck on campus. He happened to give a talk that day, and I had talked to him after. He called me when the snow started and said, "Do you want to join me and some other researchers for dinner?" And this actually led to me getting back involved fairly immediately after joining. This is within 6 months of me joining the company. I already was starting to talk again with with the quantum group that had literally just really just began at Microsoft. While they had done research in quantum prior, this was really the moment when it was starting to come together. And so I started, talking more with Mike and others, and over a period of maybe 4 to 5 years, right, I had some interns in the space again. But then in 2010, we took a larger, really a larger approach there. And we started a group to focus on quantum computation, quantum algorithms, quantum software, because we recognized we could not only be invested in the theory and the hardware side, right? You really need to understand, what do you do with these machines. What do we want to run on the machines? How are we going to do that? How are we going to protect them from noise? So we really expanded our approach to quantum computing, our investment there, and really that's kind of the early days, right, of what we now have, and the types of breakthroughs you're mentioning. It's that early research and early discovery that has now led and guided us to where we are today, where we now know what do we want to do with the quantum machine, right? We know how to focus that work. We then can architect the machine according to what we want to do with it, right? And now we're starting to see some amazing breakthroughs in the quantum space, right? Notably starting to see the ability to have, right, resilient quantum computation, right? Early fault-tolerant quantum computation.
It's really quite amazing. I mean, I remember I was asked by these CEOs, they were called the Financial Services Roundtable in 2015. It just so happened the CEOs were the top CEOs of financial services. And they asked me to look 10 years into the future. And I said, you're going to have to look at quantum computing. And they pushed back. They said, no, it's like 2100, if at all. I mean, and I remember internally within the ACM, because I'm on the practitioner board in past year, and I was saying to them internally, we got to start paying attention to quantum computing or quantum information science. And it's just incredible where it used to be considered an outlier. Now it's a serious area, and you have really a lot of companies investing in it, and investing in using Microsoft Azure Quantum, right? Because then it's accessible, and it's a pathway. You got to start looking at it now and developing things and on that pathway, so that as it scales, you can then embrace it and incorporate it, right? So, so you've seen this journey too, and are you, where are you on this sort of optimism scale? It's no longer 2100, right? It's kind of more in the nearer term. Can you prognosticate a little bit, or do you think you prefer not?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's I think rewinding, right, when I finished my my PhD, it was in a very different place, right? That we had qubits. Right, and I say it that way because there were qubits in existence, but I would not call it a quantum machine. It was not programmable, right? It was not, well, we didn't really have the scale of the cloud we even have now, right? It was a very different environment. And while we had identified that, for example, some algorithms existed, we didn't really understand what they would really cost to run on a machine, right? And then fast forward now, something like 20 years, right? Fast forward to where we are today. We have quantum machines. They're in Azure. They're in the Microsoft cloud. And now we have advanced them to what I call level 2, right? What we refer to as level 2. And think of quantum machines, there's 3 levels. Okay. So level 1 would be kind of your qubits, right? These are NISQ machines, noisy intermediate scale quantum machines. So they're noisy. They're not scaled up to do, the scientific or commercially advantageous problems, right? They can't give that advantage yet. They can do it for some contrived problems, but you're really operating on that physical hardware, right? And that physical hardware is noisy. So that's level 1. And all quantum machines start at level 1, right? You need to show you have qubits, that you can operate them, that you can read them out. So level 1, all quantum machines, level 1. And that's where we've been. In April 2024, right? April this year, we were able to move to level 2, right, for the first time in the industry. And we did that work. Microsoft and Quantinuum collaborated together to show for, the first time on record that we could show that by using quantum error correction, by using what we call qubit virtualization, we could create a better machine, a more performant machine than the physical hardware alone. So this is your resilient level. This is where you start to operate on what we call logical qubits, and you get to achieve deeper and deeper computation here, right? Ultimately, we want to then graduate to level 3, which is scale, right? We need 1,000 and more logical qubits in order to show commercial quantum advantage, right? Quantum advantage for the problems that are really going to move the needle in chemistry, right? Problems that will help us address everything from fertilizer production, right? Which can help with food scarcity, that can help address global warming, right? How do we go about capturing or combating, carbon? It's really about having these and understanding these catalysis style problems. We need to understand these reactions at high accuracy in order to mimic them, for example, industrially, right? And so scale is about solving those types of problems, these problems in chemistry, material science, where they're going to give us an advantage and we can never solve them classically, right? And so level 3 scale, that's around 1,000 and more logical qubits, right? So we have these 3 levels: level 1, level 2, and level 3. And when we look ahead, I obviously am a believer, but I do believe level 3 is now measured in years, not decades, right? Achieving level 3 is measured in years, not decades. And today we are standing at level 2, right? And not all machines, right? Not all quantum machines, not all types of qubits will make it to level 3, and not all will even make it to level 2. So it's really about identifying the right type of qubit, the right quantum architecture that will get you all the way to scale. And, rewinding to that snowstorm, why did I agree to go, chat with Mike more? Not only because he's amazing and, brilliant, and, but on top of that, right, he had shared that day a new approach to qubits that I had not heard of before, topological qubits. And I thought, wow, digging into those types of qubits, I thought this could work. This could get us to scale. And we've been on that journey ever since, developing a topological quantum machine that will get us to level 3 scale.
So let's unpack, because there's a lot here, right? So we talked about this noisy kind of quantum computing that's in existence, and how you're trying to ameliorate that and create something that's a little bit more stable, right? So, and you talked about this major breakthrough, and in fact, I interviewed Elias of Quantinuum, and I've interviewed Tony when he was still president. Now he's
Yes.
But they're very optimistic, and they were really, they're very excited about a fidelity, and in fact, they did an announcement of 3/9 fidelity, which is sort of a measure of stability, or sort of more stable and error-free.
Right.
And then maybe getting to 4/9 fidelity, and that's where you can get into enough stabilities, logical qubits, and the ability to scale, and then you can do commercial. You can apply them to real problems, solving real situations that you describe. So that announcement, let's drill into that a little bit more. Let's unpack that a little bit more, because I think it's just fascinating. Can you? So a lot of my audience, by the way, are CEOs. I would say the number one audience of my interviews are CEOs. So how would you describe this idea of coherence and noise, and how you through this process you've been able to create logical qubits where you can do something with? And can you quantify that in some way? Like, how is your breakthrough in April so different than before? Can you give me a number that kind of CEOs could say, oh, I get that number?
Right. Yeah. So really it comes down to, right, you have your physical qubits, right? These are the qubits in the hardware, in the system, that you can access those directly, right? Those are the, operating as what we call this NISQ machine, noisy intermediate scale quantum. But these physical qubits they have too much noise to enable, say, a longer computation. Why do we care about getting to longer computation? It's because when we get to longer computation that remains reliable, we're able to provide scientific and commercial advantage from the quantum solution, right? From running this on a quantum computer. So if the quantum computer is always so noisy that we can't get a solution better than classical, right? We really shouldn't be building it. But what's what's amazing, right, is there are algorithms where if we can scale up and run those algorithms, right, we will get solutions that take longer than the lifetime of the universe to run on a classical machine, right? That gives us accuracy. We don't have access. We literally do not have access to that level of accuracy with classical machines alone. With digital computers, supercomputers take all of the classical compute in the world, right? It will not be able to solve some of these problems. And so we want to build quantum machines for this reason. But they have to be able to have very deep computation, right? We need to be able to run them for, say, a month runtime, right, without encountering errors, right, or a level of error that corrupts the solution. So physical qubits alone are simply too noisy to do this, right? You talked about 3 nines, right? 3 nines, what does that translate to? It tells me how many operations I have before I have an error, right? So 99.9, 99, right? You want more and more nines. I want, 99 says I have, 99% reliability, right? So if I can run 99 operations, but I can't run more than that without a fault. So I need to make sure I can get through not just thousands of operations, but I need to get through, 10 to the 12, 10 to the 15, 10 to the 18 operations, right? And so that means I need 10 to the minus 12, 10 to the minus 15, 10 to the minus 18 in terms of those error rates. And so these are very, very small error rates, right? We have to make it through incredibly long computation. Physical hardware is really able to get to 3, 4, our topological approach promises 5 to 6 nines, but most hardware is in that 3 to 4 nines range. We need to bootstrap somehow to get to the 12, 15, 18 9 range, right? And so that's a big jump. We can make that jump using quantum error correction, right? Using these approaches of qubit virtualization, where we take a pool of physical qubits, we operate them like a unit, right? So we use this redundancy to give us protection against errors, protection against noise. It's a lot like taking a majority vote, right? If you take 3 copies of something and one of them gets corrupted, well, you now have 2 copies, right? And so if you take the vote of the 3, you still get the right answer, right? So it's really like using these types of techniques, but in a quantum mechanical way that obeys the rules of quantum mechanics, that enables us to protect these devices. So in this April result, what we were able to do, and why it's it really gave me goosebumps when we saw it worked, because for the first time we showed that we had a large separation between what we could achieve with this qubit virtualization, right? Creating logical qubits. The logical qubit was, or is, right, better now than the physical qubit, right? This means that by using error correction, the error correction is working, and I can start to really push on deeper and deeper computation. Without it, there is no path to running algorithms at scale. It is absolutely critical to have logical qubits that are more performant than your physical, and not just an order of magnitude more performant, right? Many orders of magnitude more performant is what we need to get to. And so we showed that we could get 800 times better, error rate. So that's for the first time, right? You're looking at 2 orders of magnitude and more, right? Almost 3 orders of magnitude better. That's what we need to see, and we need to continue to drive that type of improvement. And not every qubit can do that, right? The beauty here is with the Quantinuum hardware and with the Quantinuum team, we were able to really co-optimize the solution, right? Co-design our quantum error correction with the hardware in mind, with the types of constraints in that hardware. And the fact that Quantinuum's hardware has a really good 2-qubit gate fidelity, right? So their underlying physical qubits have good fidelities to start with. We can capitalize on that to drive it to a better logical error rate. And so together we did that type, that work to get this 800 times improvement in error rate.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's like analogous to an AI machine learning, which is a separate area from this, but where Jeffrey Hinton and ImageNet, right, where that they had such a radical performance or accuracy
Yes.
ability or reduction in error ability that, and it was so significant that it actually changed the entire area of AI and machine learning. In fact, the whole industry moved to their style, and before it was kind of fragmented, right? So
Right.
I thought this was a seminal moment, and when I read the piece, I was pretty excited. Just when I said, "We could interview Krysta on this because I think it's so significant." Let's unpack topological as well, because there's so many different kinds of quantum computing from a hardware standpoint, and Microsoft has the embedding on topological, right? And so can you maybe kind of give an overview of some of the other sort of what the field is like, and why you're focusing on topological, or why you're making one of the bets on topological?
Yeah, absolutely. So, we really need to reach, as I mentioned, this level 3, right? We need to get to scale. That means we need upwards of 1,000 logical qubits. So what does that mean under the hood, right? I said these logical qubits are made from pools of physical qubits. Under the hood, that means you have upwards of 1 million physical qubits, right? So today's machines vary in sizes, in numbers of physical qubits. You're looking anywhere from like tens of physical qubits to maybe a couple hundred physical qubits, right? But ultimately, we need to get to a machine that can house and operate across 1 million physical qubits, right? So there's constraints there, right? Immediately, just take the number 1 million. You're going to need the right size qubit to fit 1 million, right? In something that doesn't end up being the size of a football field or a skyscraper. So indeed, some qubit designs will require the size of a football field or a skyscraper. That's a hard machine to operate, right? So our topological approach really works to sit in the sweet spot of the characteristics you need to reach scale, right? To reach that 1 million physical qubit mark and beyond. So to get there, size is one of the characteristics. The topological qubit is the right size such that, the chip on your credit card, we can fit millions on that chip, right? So it has just the right size. On top of that, right, we talked about fidelity or error rate, right? We need to have qubits that have a very good initial fidelity, right, at the physical level, so that we require fewer resources in terms of the overheads of fault tolerance, right? The overheads of qubit virtualization. We use many physical qubits to create a logical qubit. If those physical qubits start out with a better fidelity, that makes error correction more powerful and less costly. So our physical qubits in the topological system, they'll have 5 to 6 nines at the start, right? In contrast to other types of qubits that will be limited to the 3 to 4 nines range, right? So starting at the 5 to 6 nines gives an advantage in terms of the overhead. You'll need fewer physical qubits to achieve scale. And then you also need to make sure you have the right speed of operation, right? Ultimately, we want to do very long computations, right? Computations that have, like I said, 10 to the 12, 10 to the 15, 10 to the 18 operations. So when you start to look at the speed of the operation on the physical qubit, you need to make sure it's fast enough that computation doesn't take a century, right? So we want to make sure that these quantum algorithms, these quantum solutions can really compute and deliver a solution within about a month, right? A matter of a couple weeks, 2 to 3 weeks. We don't want to have to run the quantum machine even for a year, or let alone we definitely don't want to run for a century. So it's really important you have the right speed of operation. And this means that you need to have this logical operation roughly on about a 10 microsecond time per logical operation. So that's where, again, the topological qubit has the right speed of operation. There are other qubits that take more like a millisecond time, right? And now, that adds orders of magnitude to your runtime. So we want to keep the right operation time. So the investment in topological qubits, it's really because we're absolutely convicted that to reach scale, we need each of these properties, and the topological qubit fits, meets each of these properties.
I mean, I can see the profound implications of all of this. And so, we've been talking about qubits, and again, because I do have CEOs in the audience, so I think, well, what's a qubit and how does that differ from sort of classical digital computers? And then people hear these terms of superposition and entanglement and interference, and how does those things make quantum better? And then they hear things like, well, there's kind of enormous parallelism jump with quantum, and nature is quantum, so somehow there's a fit, and that's why it's very good at solving these kind of really difficult novel material problems or pharmaceutical problems or climate issues or these big challenges. So can you give a sort of a CEO kind of view of how quantum is different, and if we interleave some of those concepts in there? And then let's see if we can then take that into things like the practical tools that you've developed, the languages you've developed. You've got a cloud service that you've developed. How does that work with exascale or supercomputing intermixed with quantum-inspired algorithms, intermixed with with AI machine learning? So let's kind of build to that, but starting with, how is this different from digital? Why is it superior? And then let's get into some of the accessibility of this through Microsoft Quantum, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So you've raised so many important points here with regard to quantum computing, the role it plays, and how it will happen, right? How it will operate. And it's different, right? It's the thing to remember about quantum computing is it's not going to be the choice for everything, right? Our classical computers are really good, right? Digital computers are really good at a lot of things, right? We now have them pretty much all around us all the time, right? It's in your pocket probably right now. You're probably surrounded by a bunch of digital devices. They're pretty good at what they do, right? And definitely, with the continued growth in AI, right? With now co-pilots, right? You can interact with them in these wonderful new ways, and they're very smart, right? You have a lot of great tools around you, so we really want to make sure when we go to use and select a quantum computer for the job, right? We want to make sure we use it for the right job, right? For the right problem. And we want to make sure we're still taking advantage of what digital computers and AI are good at, right? So it's really about using a quantum machine among, integrated along with these other computational capabilities and tools, right? So we really view quantum computing as hybrid. Quantum computers don't operate by themselves and they don't stand alone. It's an integrated environment. You have HPC, the cloud, operating and integrated with AI, operating and integrated with quantum computers, right? So it's really a hybrid supercomputing system across all of those, right? And so, much like when you program GPUs, right, you're often using a CPU and GPUs, right? It's that type of framing that we want, that we have here, right? Quantum, when you get a quantum solution, you're going to be plugging it back into, a classical simulation you might be doing where you're also pulling from AI models, right? It's a very integrated and hybrid approach. So I think that's one really important thing to remember is that quantum computers don't operate alone. They're not great at everything, right? So which problems, right? What do we use a quantum computer for? What should we use it for? You could use it for a lot of things, but it might be very slow and it might be very expensive. So where is it really, really powerful? And you said something important, Stephen, right? You said, well, nature computes this way, right? And this is key, right? Nature, we want to compute closer to how nature computes. And it's these quantum mechanical calculations, right, where quantum computers end up being really, really, really good. And this makes sense. It's a quantum mechanical machine, right? So what better thing to pair it with than kind of how it's built already, right? So it turns out, and we've studied this now for well over the last decade, right? Or nearly 2 decades now. We've studied the different potential applications for quantum machines. We've worked to understand how much do they really cost when you map it all the way down to that quantum plane, right, to the quantum machine itself. And what we find is that, really to see speed ups from quantum computers, you really want to focus on problems where you don't have a lot of input data, right? So I like to think of it as kind of this two-sided funnel, right? So you have a small amount of input data. Then you have an explosion in the computational space, right? So that's where you get the parallelism, right? You have this parallel computation, but only, right? But you have limited input. And then similarly, you actually have limited output. So we know we need low input, low output problems where we still need a lot of computation. And it turns out, so this sounds like it might be limiting, but it turns out this is the area of quantum chemistry, materials science, and that might sound somewhat niche, but 96% of the world's manufactured goods, right, rely on chemistry and materials science. And those goods impact 100% of humanity. So this is literally what's all around us. We need to feed our planet. We need to save our planet. How do we go about doing that? With advances in chemistry and materials science. So what we're really grounded in, right? Going back to Microsoft's mission of empowering people and organizations to do more, right? Our mission here is to accelerate scientific discovery so that we can give these very kind of cutting edge tools, right? In a way, right? Integrated HPC, AI, and quantum integrated together to enable accelerating scientific discovery. And quantum machines are really good at chemistry and materials science. It's a huge space that we need a lot more discovery, right? We want to take the next 250 years of work in chemistry and materials science, and we really do want to compress that into the next 2 decades, because that's what's going to enable us to help save our planet and feed our planet. So these are the tools we need to get there, right? These are the types of applications we need to be able to run, right? So that we can create new catalysts, right? Find new drugs, help develop better batteries, right? All of these things will be benefited, right? Improved through the use of quantum machines.
And there's supply chains and logistics optimization, so it could help there perhaps, or...
Yeah, so our studies, we've done a lot of work on that, and it turns out, you need a very large quantum machine in the space of optimization. And so optimization on paper, absolutely, quantum algorithms can give a speed up, but in practice, you need an extremely large quantum computer to do that. And so, our belief, right, and it's beyond belief, like it's just quantum computers are really good at chemistry and materials science. That's a nice small input, small output problem, but optimization doesn't fall into that category, right? You really need to make sure, mathematically we say you need super polynomial speedups here. So the polynomial speedup is not enough. What happens is when you really pull that down through, again, we have to use things like error correction. We have to use these different tools, right? We have to get it all the way onto the hardware. When you do that for problems in optimization, it is simply far, far too expensive. So that is very far away. Whereas applications in chemistry and material science, right, I believe we can scale a quantum machine to, run those types of problems within a decade. And we can run those problems even much earlier for scientific advantage. So we really do want to focus on chemistry and materials science problems for that quantum machine.
In the literature, you read about cold matter physics, because it has application into semiconductors and superconductors. And there's this announcement on N quantum Monte Carlo simulation because of the business applications. Do you think that's still further out? And you mentioned that you're really looking at you're doing a lot of deep research to see what are sort of the near-term practical ways that you can apply that. Can the audience get this through Azure Quantum, get this information to guide them? How easy is it for researchers, but also businesses to access Azure Quantum? There's been announcements about Microsoft Quantum Elements, and there was this big announcement about searching through novel materials, over 33 million novel materials for a new kind of battery. Okay, so can you talk about some of those things? And then I'd like to talk about quantum computing languages, compilers, mapping that to quantum hardware, and some of the work you're doing with open software, like Q Sharp and QIR. So
great. Well, let's start with, when we think about using these using a quantum computer, right? In terms of using that quantum computer, like I said, you really want to use that with AI, right? With the cloud, right? So it operates together. And we have built up Azure Quantum Elements. So Elements is this platform for scientific discovery. Think of it like, it's like your computational workbench. It's like your computational lab, right? So imagine, you're a scientist and you spend decades in a wet lab, right? Working on different solutions, literally like solutions in this case, right? And you're spending decades to find that maybe the next drug or the next battery material or the next chemical reaction, right? It's a long process when you're having to do this work in a wet lab. So really, we want to pull that scientific discovery. You still want to have the wet lab, but you want to be able to predict better what to send to the wet lab. So think of it as this funnel, right? If I can have an explosion of options, right? If I can look across many millions of options and computationally whittle it down to, say, 10, and then maybe with a human in the loop to, say, 1 or 2 that then I actually synthesize in the lab, right? That gives me a very faster rate of discovery, right? It's a much faster rate of discovery. And you mentioned, the work we did in Elements with Pacific Northwest National Laboratories, right? What we did is we were able to use the Elements platform. So this is a platform, again, a computational workbench, if you will, that brings together AI, HPC, and as we scale up our quantum machines, right, it also integrates the quantum machine. And so for the right problems, you pull the quantum machine into your workflow. That's not for every problem, but for the right problems, right? And for other problems, you pull in many layers of AI models. You pull in many layers of advanced simulation capabilities, physics simulations that tell you more detail about the molecular structure, the properties of the material, right? Things you want to filter for. So you can use this in the case with Pacific Northwest National Laboratories. We were looking at a new battery material and essentially generated 32 million candidates. And using the power of HPC and AI, we were able together to filter that down to a handful of candidates, of which we chose one to then synthesize in the lab. Now, this workflow, right, this ability to go from tens of millions of candidates down to, say, order 10 potential ones, 80 hours. And traditionally, this would take 2 decades, right? So you're doing something now that was decades-long time scale in a matter of a week, right, or so. And then you can choose one to go synthesize in the lab. That takes several months. In this case, we spent 9 months. Then PNNL worked to synthesize this material in the lab. And indeed, it works, right? We powered a clock with it. It has 70% less lithium. Lithium is a scarce, expensive resource. It uses sodium in its place. And so this now gives, a very interesting new material. But what's so amazing is this workflow, right? That then you can lift and apply to different industries, right? To different potential scientific discoveries. Now we can add the quantum machine in the mix here. And we've done end-to-end demonstrations of having the quantum machine in the mix, doing a chemistry calculation where then from the data, you can train an AI model. And now we have the logical qubits coming, right? We are bringing the logical qubit capabilities to Azure Quantum Elements. And so I think really when you think about using the quantum machine, you want to use it in the Elements type of pipeline, right? In the Elements platform where you're using it alongside AI and HPC. And so we've built Elements with this in mind. And not only do we have Elements here, we have paired Copilot with it, right? So we have an Azure Quantum Copilot that helps you learn how to program the quantum machine. It helps you learn more about chemistry and materials science, right? So now you can, if you sit on one side or the other, right, you can learn to speak the other language to further your own scientific discovery.
You were really curious as a young person in high school, and you got mentored by a physics teacher, and that curiosity continued in your academic career and then through research. And you won things like, Best Paper Awards and, 2010 Yahoo Learning to Rank Challenge. I mean, at ACM Best of 2013 Notable Article Award, Business Insider Most Powerful Female Engineers of 2018. You're a fellow of the National Academy of Sciences. You're advisor to the National Quantum Initiative. I mean, the list goes on because of this ability and access. What if I'm a high school student and I'm watching this video with you, this interview? Is there any way they can get access to Microsoft Quantum elements or not?
Yeah, so what's great is, starting with Copilot, right? When I think, and I love speaking with high school students and showing how these tools work, because they really, you don't have to know the depths of quantum mechanics, right? I came into this field through mathematics and computer science. And so you can engage and develop for a quantum machine, right? You don't need to know all the details underneath. And if you want to know the details underneath, what better way to learn quantum mechanics than playing with a quantum computer that is actually quantum mechanical, right? And so as a student, right, or even if you're not a student and you're just looking to learn, you can go and access Azure Quantum Copilot. And with Copilot, it's free, it's online, embedded right in the browser. You can with Copilot write your first quantum program and deploy it, right? So you can become engaged pretty much immediately during this video. You can pull up a browser right next, in the tab next door, and try Azure Quantum Copilot. And that's a great, first step, I think, into this area where you can ask it questions about quantum computing, about quantum chemistry, about material science, about molecules, right? It's grounded in a mixture of quantum computing and the chemistry and material science space. And so that Copilot, has that multi-knowledge, and you can start to engage with it, right? Ask questions, learn, ask it to help write a quantum program for the first time, right? So I think that's a great first step, especially if you're in high school, and a way to start learning in different, new domains, new directions, and find out, where your knowledge overlaps and where you can continue to grow.
That's really, really fascinating. I'm actually embedded in the executive working group for the CEO Leadership Alliance, and we've got a talent initiative where we've embedded AI. But it's not just for K to 12, it's also for college, university, and those who have graduated. We're trying to kind of democratize the access to job and skills. I mean, indicating that they need to look at quantum. You provided a path. And by the way, that just scaled to the National Talent Collaborative, working with 25 other CEO groups throughout the US. And in fact, the last meeting was chaired, or Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan was sort of heading up the New York edition of it. So there's this big interest among CEOs to how do we embrace this? How do we incorporate this so it's accessible? And you just gave a plan to make it accessible. And I've got a keynote to 400 CEOs coming up. I'm going to go online. I'm going to record an interaction and say, you know what? It's all available. And Krysta said so. Can I say that? Krysta said so, right?
Absolutely. Yes, it's all available, and it's free to get started. If you want to deploy on, a real quantum machine as well, we also have an Azure Quantum Credits program where you can, for free, run on a variety of different quantum machines that are in Azure today. So it is really real, right? It's real, it's available, it's accessible. We have tons of samples too. If you want to start digging into different quantum algorithms, you want to go deeper. You can interact with Copilot to guide your learning. In addition, you can dive deep into a lot of the documentation we have and samples in Jupyter notebooks. It's very accessible and also open source, right? So we have open sourced our quantum development kit, Q#, the compiler here, our quantum intermediate representation. So we really do want to help further this area and make it easy and accessible to program and develop for quantum computing.
So, Krysta, you're so accessible in terms of how you explain things, and it's just marvelous. And you've got such a tremendous background as well. We were down to our last question. What question do you want to throw out to my audience, or what recommendation do you want to throw up to the audience? And
yeah, I think, when I think about why I entered this field, right? I really wanted to see the ability to take these, right, again, these disruptive technologies and apply them to what we need as a society, as humanity. And I think we're at this amazing point, right? It's just, it's just chilling, right? We have quantum machines scaling up, right? We have AI, we have the cloud, right? Making it much more accessible than when I was in school. So there's this amazing opportunity, right? And you have co-pilots that can help you learn. I feel like it's time that we really push that interdisciplinary capability, right? That you think about, what do you know? How do you want to leave a mark on this world? And then think about, how can you pull in these different tools, right? They're integrated together in for example, elements. And that gives you the ability to pull on these tools that maybe you thought wasn't in your path, right? Maybe you've been more of an experimental scientist, but now you have the ability to learn these computational tools. Or maybe you've been on the computational side and you haven't understood, maybe all the interdisciplinary problems that are at your fingertips. So I feel like we're at this moment that is just, it's such a pivotal moment, and it's a critical moment to capitalize on. So I just encourage people listening today, go try these. Try Azure Quantum Copilot, try these tools, but really think about, how can you create bridges, right? I think it's all about the bridges between different disciplines, and it's driving that communication, that conversation, right? That's going to enable us to get to the next level, right? Whether it's chemistry and quantum computing, or maybe there's quantum computing in biology, or quantum computing in physics, right? Quantum computing in material science, right? This is a tool that we can take advantage of across disciplines. And the more we can talk, right? We can speak with each other. I think the more acceleration we'll have.
yeah, and speaking about, let's collaborate, work together as a community, and
Yes.
doing that because you're on the National Quantum Initiative, the Advanced Scientific Computing Advisory Committee, Department of Energy, the ASSEC Committee, DARPA, et cetera. So thank you for sharing so many of your insights with our audience. It's just really, really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Stephen. It's been a pleasure having this discussion for the last hour.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.